it's a natural evolution, I think, of what started as a around the world, you didn't really have a choice as an employer. You kind of had to have everyone working from home or primarily working from home, moving more to this kind of let's try to work with experimentation around these so-called hybrid arrangements, to what we've seen a lot more of in the last 12 to 18 months, particularly here in Australia, which is the pandemic is over in the sense that it once existed. And we want and need people to resume their ways of working pre-2020. So this next step is significant employers saying, look, this is not just a request, or wouldn't it be nice if you return to those arrangements and those ways of working. This is something that we are going to make as a critical component of whether you actually are entitled to have a job with us. And that's a very significant statement. In the US, there are a lot more liberties and licenses allowed for employers because they have this notion of what's referred to as employment at will. In Australia, it's not quite at the point where employment can be terminated as readily or as easily as it can in some other countries. But this is a really significant development. And in my view, there's no prohibition around employers in Australia considering doing something very similar.
Interesting. We'll get to the Australian question in just a moment, but just to reiterate, because if this is actually being used as a criteria to determine who stays and who goes, to put it in very plain language, when job cuts are being made, what is the rationale that's being used? Are they having to say, look, you're more productive, or we have stats that measure the lack of productivity at home? Like, how are they justifying it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And if we think about why is it that an organisation, any organisation, is introducing change, our mind naturally gravitates to, the employer is just trying to save costs. Well, that might be a part of it, but the reality is that employers that are interested in surviving and thriving are not just cutting costs for the sake of cutting costs. They're looking at cost cutting as part of overall measures that are going to make their business more successful, more sustainable. Now, the relevance of that in the context of where people are working from is, and what Google and other employers in the US who are coming out with this are saying is, look, part of what we have identified as critical success determinants for our organisation in the future is based significantly around how people connect with each other, how we educate our people, how we train our people, how we set up our people for success. Now, we feel, they say, that this is something that is best done, and they have their reasons for it and they have their data for it. This is best done and most consistent with the way we want to do it, because ultimately that's the employer's prerogative in terms of how they want to train, how they want people to be successful. This is best done when people are working in the office, in the primary place of work, where they're co-located. So a lot of the things that have been paid lip service to over the last few years around teamwork and camaraderie and getting to know, organisations are now saying, look, these aren't just nice to have. These are what we have identified as absolutely mission critical for our success.
So interesting how this is evolving. I mean, we've never seen anything like this before. Joydeep, you and I have been speaking about this for the past, 4 years. So bottom line, do you think that something like this, or using this as part of a criteria for, employment essentially, is going to be legal here in Australia?
Yeah, so when it comes to restructuring and redundancies in an Australian legal context, the starting point is the definition of a redundancy is when the employer no longer wishes a position to be performed by anyone. When you're going through a significant job cut situation where you're reducing the number of employees by 10, 15% or whatever it might be, you're easily going to satisfy that part of the definition. So then you're in the territory of, to be legally compliant, you have to go through some process, which involves consultation, which involves considering people for redeployment. Considering people for redeployment when you're reducing your headcount is going to be a pretty easy thing to satisfy because there are unlikely to be jobs for them to go to. So then the final frontier really for employers to get across the line on something like this legally here in Australia is to ensure that those individuals who have been selected for redundancy have been chosen fairly. And importantly, that the employer has not used any unlawful discriminatory criteria in making that decision. Now, the really important word here is unlawful, because obviously you're entitled to say that these employees are better performers, at least according to management in a particular business. So performance is not an unlawful criterion. Uh, Examples of unlawful criteria would be a person's sex or race, or if they're pregnant and things like that. Where a person is working from is not an unlawful criterion to be used. So there's not going to be an immediate risk of anything from a discrimination point of view. The only exceptions to that might be if someone has to work from home to accommodate, for example, carers' responsibilities or some of those other circumstances which are recognised legally as, let me call it, valid reasons for a person to be working from home. But the employees who have just been working from home because that was an opportunity given to them in 2020 or 2021 and have continued because it works for them and they like it and it suits their lifestyle and whatever else, are not going to be protected if their employment is brought to an end for a reason such as this here in Australia.
Now, what if I am an employee who has been working from home or majority working from home? I get wind that there are redundancies coming or somebody taps me on the shoulder. Can I then say, no, I'm happy to come into the office?
Yeah, well, employees, like everyone, need to read the room, and employers will often telegraph these kinds of changes. And I'm sure that, like most organisations here, if an employer has a view or leadership have a view around their preference as to where people are working from, it's not going to be a secret. It's going to be well known to the majority of employees working in that organisation. Now, if employees are aware of that as a preference and they are just waiting to see whether that becomes enacted as an edict from their employer, well, that's pretty silly, with the greatest respect. Employees who want to keep their jobs at those organisations, and they may not want to, but if they do, they need to understand that they've got to be more proactive. They've got to try to fit in with what the employer wants, and be proactive about it, not just do so at a time when the employer says, well, we're making redundancies. So employees can be practical, but it's a matter for everyone to weigh up, isn't it?